Welcome to this special RUSI podcast, the options in Syria and the ongoing problems. It is clear from what Donald Trump has been saying that the retaliation for the latest use of chemical weapons, possibly the 25th use that we've seen in Syria recently, according to UN war crimes investigators, must be bigger than the last reaction in 2017, which was 59 Tomahawk land attack missiles. The discussions over how it will happen and when it happens appear to be ongoing. It seems highly likely that both the US, France and the UK will play an active part. But there are other partners that look like they're also going to take some form of place within the coalition that undertakes whatever reaction this would be. That in itself is complex. Previously, the strikes were unilateral. From a US perspective. Building this out into another coalition is more difficult. And there's a reticence to do so as well on the basis of, possibly solely on the basis of UK parliamentary discussions and the failed vote in 2013 under Prime Minister David Cameron. This therefore presents something of a challenge for the actors that are around, and it also proves an opportunity perhaps for Russia over how it performs as the strategic balancer. Is it the problem set? I'm not sure. Today we're joined by Jonathan Eyal, Justin Bronk, Mike Stephens and Ewan Lawson for a discussion. And Mike, I wanted to ask you first about these other allies. There's been a lot of press about the UK, about France, about obviously President Trump's tweets and all the rest of it. But what about the wider coalition?
Well, there's been a lot of noise coming from the Arab Gulf states, particularly from Qatar, to play some sort of role in this coalition. I think there are a number of reasons as to why they're being so vocal about it. One is that they've been itching to have a go at Assad now for the last 6 to 7 years. This presents a good opportunity for them to do that. Two, I think that both Saudi Arabia and Qatar, in the midst of their dispute with one another, want to appear to be as useful as possible to the United States, to the United Kingdom and France, so that they can get some diplomatic capital to play off their little games against each other. And whoever is more useful will probably come out of this thinking that they've got the ear of the president on their side. But I think lastly, there is, and this was clear in Libya as well, when the Qataris and Emiratis were part of the airstrike campaign in Libya, a sense that the Arab world wants to be involved in security issues that affect the Arab world, and that this should not just be done by Western powers at the behest of Western decision makers, which alienate Arab states from their own affairs. The Gulf states see their interests as being intimately tied into the survival of the regime of Bashar al-Assad, and mainly its backer, Iran. And so for them, this would constitute an ability to escalate against the Iranian regime and its allies without necessarily directly coming into conflict with the Iranians. So there's a number of opportunities for the Gulf states here. I think in terms of military capacity, it will be extremely limited. But it's the signaling and it's the sense that they are providing an air of legitimacy to what the West is doing. And I think that's what they'll try and play off.
But, and I want to come back to this at the end, but there's also a really important point, not just about Arab participation in this, but also the Persian element of this as well. You know, Iran, I guess, has more skin in the game in this than Russia at the moment. And I want to talk about, if we have time at the end, both the Iranian implications of Arab work here, but also then how Israel plays into this, because you've got to add that in as well. But before I come to that, this feels very much like a sort of us and them, a two-sided discussion, and we seem to be ignoring what I think is, the other key player in the room, which is Russia. And much of the discussion in the media is all about, the Western attitude to this and the Syrian reaction. We see some of the Russian public responses. But Jonathan, what do you feel is the underlying currents within Russia in terms of how this is developing? Is Putin actually winding back? Has he been given an off-ramp? Is he being the mature global statesman? Where do we think that Russia is playing into this part?
I think we're witnessing about 2 or 3 different messaging from Moscow. On the one hand, there was this view from Russia that a year ago, almost precisely to the day when we had the previous American Tomahawk attacks. The Russians didn't respond, and there was a feeling in Moscow that perhaps they needed to let the Americans vent off spleen and to stop there. But somehow, this time it looks very different. First of all, the Russians have upped the game. If it is true that some of their S-400s batteries have been integrated into a defense system, if it is true that the ambush that the Russians with the Iranians may have done on Israel a few weeks ago was concocted together, then we are witnessing a very significant ramp up from Moscow. On the whole, I suspect that Putin would want very much to de-escalate this current sort of war of words with Washington. So we've seen two messaging. The Russian ambassador to Beirut, to neighboring Lebanon, threatening an immediate Russian retaliation. But interestingly, Russia's own state-controlled media did not repeat the statement from their ambassador. So clearly we're looking here at a sort of fork tongue kind of messaging. I think the real problem for Putin is that despite the bluster, they're not actually doing very well. They're not doing very well because they can't control their Bashar al-Assad. Bashar al-Assad now believes that he's got more ability, more room for maneuver than Moscow. They're not doing very well because they can't deliver to the Israelis, where the Russians promised to deliver in the past about toning down on the Iranian involvement in Syria. And they're not doing very well themselves because it's not very obvious how they could extricate themselves from a binary decision, which is either they confront the American or American-led operation that is about to come in Syria, or they don't do anything, in which case they end up being exposed as a damn squib. It's precisely trying to avoid that binary choice that has been the best strategy of Putin. I think we're reaching the end of the road from Moscow. So set aside the bluster that comes from Moscow. The reality is that they're far, far less secure about how this will play for them in the next few days.
Okay, and on that basis, are we almost saying that we're safer doing nothing and letting the Moscow decision-making complex implode? And if we were in a world without certain personalities, in that might indeed be feasible. Is that possibly the case?
No, it's not. First of all, we've reached a situation. I mean, there are consequences to firing off tweets of the American president. The consequence is that if nothing happens now, it would be the American position which would suffer catastrophic damage in terms of credibility in the Middle East. So doing nothing is no longer an option. It would allow Mr. Putin to claim that it was his bluster that achieved this particular outcome. So again, doing nothing is no longer feasible. The real question is whether there are any lines of communications behind the scenes with Moscow, either in terms of deconflicting about any operations on the ground, or in terms of messaging to Moscow not to push this too far. This has the potential to go horribly wrong very, very quickly if the Russians sustain a lot of casualties, let's say, and then it's a question of Putin's own reputation in Moscow. But sadly, it's one of these circumstances where going back is no longer an option.
Right, so they've got to hit something. That's obviously not up for question. The key for me is, what do they hit? Last time, 59 Tomahawk missiles, the airfield that Justin could probably tell me exactly what it's. There we go. And within hours, they were flying jets off it again. So, I mean, what targets can you possibly hit without killing a large number of people, or specifically Russian people, or I guess the coalition wants to avoid killing civilians? Ewan, I mean, any ideas? What do we target?
I think it's a bigger question than that. I think what we're coming up against is, for the first time, the West is having to confront the idea that it can't just use airstrikes without any risk of response. From Sudan, Afghanistan, Iraq before 2003, this was the weapon of choice. An airstrike, do some damage, and then nothing can come back on you. Well, even if the Russians don't follow through, I think that myth has now been unravelled fairly quickly. And it was intriguing, I think, to hear responses yesterday to the ambassadors' observations along the lines of, well, if people fire back, then that's war. Well, I would argue that actually firing the missiles in the first place is pretty close to war. And I think so. I think there's a revelationary moment, perhaps, for some Western militaries and politicians at the moment. That then takes you to the so what question, and the observation about the airfield is entirely sound. It's very difficult to actually close down airfields. That's not an easy operation, and if you can't do it with 59 Tomahawks, then what can you do it with? So therefore, where do you go for sensible targets? And I think this is really problematic, and that's why for me, the sole use of a military instrument in this case is really dangerous and potentially very inappropriate. This needs to come as part of a broader campaign, perhaps with some significant diplomatic effort, rather than diplomacy by Twitter, but actually getting, Russia, Syria, if necessary, Iran around the table and saying, look, we're gonna hit some storage areas potentially. But of course, Russia wouldn't be by any storage areas anyway, because it doesn't support the use of chemical weapons, clearly in this case, and the Iranians, well, if you say in advance it's going to be about hitting chemical weapon storage areas, that of course comes with risk, because dispersal of the toxic elements from that can be problematic. So I don't really know where you go, and I don't know why we've allowed ourselves to get into the mindset where essentially this is not really about capability issues. It's not really about stopping Syrian use of chemical weapons. It's about punishment. And it's a bit of a blunt instrument for punishment. So I think we've got to have a more strategic approach. That will be difficult, particularly with the current US administration, but even in our own administration, having a strategic approach is challenging at the moment. So I'm not quite sure where we go in targeting terms.
But in terms, lots of people are saying that deterrence. This is a failure of deterrence because you've tried to deter. You've done one big punishment. We've now this might be the 25th time chemical weapons has been used. Deterrence has failed. But there is the one theory of deterrence which says deterrence by punishment is valid, and that actually you now, by each time you punish, you set the bar lower, and that you set a threshold at which people cannot push through it. I mean, this is surely still a valid act, right?
I'm not so sure. I think that the West has stood by for 7 years and watched hundreds of thousands of Syrians die, be wounded through non-chemical means, but by careless, at the very best, targeting, arguably deliberate targeting of civilians. I'm not quite sure now how you suddenly say, well, it's okay, we'll do a one-off strike and that will deter. That's my point. It's got to be part of a strategic campaign. It's got to include diplomatic elements. It's got to include formal messaging. It can't just be, we're going to hit a couple of facilities. There we go. Don't do it again, naughty boy.
But given that deterrence by punishment is still an acknowledged academic framework anyway, and that we obviously still have this desire, it might not be conceptually correct to do this, but it's fairly clear this is going to happen. So that's the promise from the tweets, it's the promise from elsewhere, this is going to happen. But
deterrence by punishment does not have to mean military on military. There are other ways of punishing.
So I want to, and absolutely, I want to get to this. So, the requirement for us to mirror. If there was a choice about mirroring, and specifically the military element, which we know is going to play a part, the three big states that you've got, potentially contributing at the moment are the US, France, and the UK. The French carrier Charles de Gaulle is tied up in a nuclear refit, not out to the end of the year. The nearest US carrier is the Harry S. Truman, which I think left last night. It's mid-Atlantic, 3 days before he gets there. So we've got some time to spend. And of course, Britain's two new fantastic aircraft carriers, the Queen Elizabeth class, neither of which has any aircraft to fly from. So Justin, no carriers. It's a relatively long way for anyone. It's a pretty hostile air defence environment. What are the military options that are left?
Well, assuming that you are not willing to go after the air defence network, which basically means you cannot use non-stealth manned aircraft over Syrian airspace during this, whatever this retaliatory attack is. That limits you to stealth assets, so only the Americans can play in that area, F-22, B-2, and even then you probably require a lot of preparation in terms of jamming, decoys, all of that sort of stuff. and standoff cruise missiles. So the US Navy does have an Aegis destroyer in the region. Last time at Shayrat for 59, that required 3. So potentially a lack of magazine depth there. It's been revealed today that the Royal Navy is sending an Astute-class submarine or possibly a T-boat. So again, there'll be a potential submarine Tomahawk capability from the UK, and the French have a cruise missile-equipped ship in the region too. There's also the potential for use of Scalp and Storm Shadow air-launched cruise missiles from Cyprus and from France itself. So there are some options, but again, as Ewan was pointing out, what do you hit? I think deterrence by punishment in the broad sense, I think is pretty unlikely to be feasible, even if you were willing to take the risk. As the Assad regime has proven very willing to fight, even with half the country as rubble. I don't think more physical destruction is going to dent that. Certainly not that we're willing to inflict. And if you're going after the chemical weapons delivery capacity, either you go after the weapons, well, that's quite difficult because the facilities, most of the actual nerve agents, so weapons-grade agents, sarin, VX, mustard gas, were destroyed after the 2013 agreement under inspection. Mostly what we're talking about is chlorine. Chlorine is very unpleasant, but it's a legitimate industrial chemical. There are cylinders everywhere. Everyone who has a swimming pool needs access to chlorine. So I don't think we're going to be able to target the sources of chlorine in Syria effectively. So the only other option is the delivery mechanism, well, that's the Syrian Air Force. Interesting to note that even if you were to try and go after all the airfields, and as we noted, 59 Tomahawks on Shayrat alone did not close down the airfield for more than a few hours. If you were to go after the Air Force, most of the Syrian Air Force's prime assets are now at Latakia on the Russian tarmac, where we cannot hit them. We've given them far too much warning for that to be an effective option. So again, you're left with symbolic strikes or probably too much of a risk to do anything else.
Great. So, clear military options, a good strategy, a nice concept of war, and a very simple, bilateral problem set of actors. This all seems to be, very simple for anyone to make a decision over. But this sort of feels like it's becoming a crucible for, one of the most challenging actions and reactions that we've got at the moment. You add to that, this is not simply the West is putting forces in. The Russian Black Sea Fleet put some units through the Bosphorus a couple of days ago. We have 11 Russian naval units that are leaving Syria at the moment, all ASW capable, so after whatever British submarine is out there. This is a huge time of great vulnerabilities with political ambition writ large, a coalition which you're trying to put together, Russian forces on the ground. Okay, what's the solution? Give me some good ideas. If this is not there, what is it? Is it leveraging against Iranian proxies in Yemen? Is the World Cup the answer? A boycott? Is it recognizing or threaten to recognize and offer membership of NATO to Ukraine and Georgia? What is going to be both acceptable politically within the ambition, military and diplomatically possible, and is going to sate the appetite of everyone out there? Somebody give me a suggestion.
Well, I think that we've missed the boat on the diplomatic outcome, partly because everyone has painted themselves into a corner where really the choice now is one side would be humiliated or would appear to have beaten a hasty retreat, and another one would have been triumphed. But I think it's worse than that. I think we have persuaded Moscow that everything in strategic terms that the Russians have achieved since they intervened militarily on the ground in September 2015 is now up for grabs. And if in that particular context, I don't see the Russians giving in at all. I think what may be feasible is precisely what Ewan has suggested, is a more delicate discussion from behind the scenes about an operation that doesn't go very far, reassures the Russians that we are not out for a decapitation of the Assad regime in Syria, and somehow manages the situation, allowing both sides to claim that they have achieved their objective. But it will require the kind of discussion behind the scenes that everyone at the moment is excluding.
Any other good ideas?
The problem with that is that Western states are then openly acknowledging that Assad is safe. Mm-hmm. You've spent the best part of 6 years aligning your diplomatic activity to trying to remove Bashar al-Assad, back the Syrian opposition, or what remains of it, which is now basically owned by Turkey. And I think that the problem is this: if we look at what happened last year in April, when there was an attempt at a diplomatic solution to this, it fell flat relatively quickly, partly because certain European countries were just not on board with bringing more pressure on the Assad regime. So if you remember, Boris Johnson went to Rome, and it was a fairly damp squib conference where there was just no consensus reached whatsoever. I don't see any real change in conditions from that time to today. It's almost like Groundhog Day, actually, which is that the same tactic, which is to say that what the Assad regime does, the Russians are responsible for, is still the tactic that is being used 12 months later. And the problem is that the only way to have ever pushed back against that, as it became more clear that the military instrument was defining the political space, was to use the military instrument. And now what we're saying is that the military instrument just isn't going to work or buy us any space whatsoever. So it may just have to be a feel-good strike, a sort of enforcement of international norms, and then we back away and let Syria go the way that it's going, which is that Assad will come out on top and eventually win.
I just build on that and simply say, the first thing I think is that one of the things we haven't mentioned is, of course, it's not that long ago that Trump was talking about America withdrawing any military engagement in Syria.
A week, to be
for 10 hours, I think.
I was trying to be a bit charitable, but yeah, it's about a week. In fact, within the week, he has gone from we're withdrawing to we're striking, and that messaging is problematic. I do think the only way to deliver effective, continuing deterrence, and deterrence of what? So deterrence of excessive use of force against civilians is really what you're talking about, whether it's by chemical weapons or by other means, is by clever targeting of the regime. What's important, deterrence is what's important to the regime, what's important to Bashar Assad, what are the things that he is not willing to give up, what are the things he's not prepared to lose, and targeting those. And some of those are financial. A lot of those are not about the things that you target with Tomahawk or Storm Shadow.
Listen, this could run and run. I mean, we've talked a lot about Syria. Actually, is this about a US-Russian relationship? Is it about actually, if this is the interplay between those two leaders and those states, the levers there, I think we know particularly what the financial levers would be, and those might be unpalatable to some in London. I mean, this is just the crucible for a most complex and difficult issue. There doesn't seem to be any clear answer, but hopefully we've gone some way to at least explaining the context. We've not got to half the questions about Persian ambitions, about Israel, about the potential fundamental change in the way we conceptualize conflict in a sort of, post-Chicago type way. These are all really, really important questions. But thank you, Jonathan, Justin, Ewan, Mike. My name is Peter Roberts. Thank you very much for joining us.